In this video, we're going to have a look at the subject matter involved around three-dimensional shapes. Now, before we jump into three-dimensional shapes, what we'll do is we'll have a bit of a review of what single-dimensional shapes are and what two-dimensional shapes are. Then after that, we'll go back and we'll have a look at the definition of the space that each of those dimensional shapes take up, and then we'll jump into three dimensions. So jumping into it, if we take ourselves back to, say, let's go one dimension, then let's have a think. If we're going to one dimension, what we're doing is we can only move in a single direction. So we can either go, for example, to the left, or we can only go to the right. Now, effectively, if we can only go to the left or right, what we actually have is simply a ruler, like so. So on a ruler, if you hold it out, so long as you don't take your finger off the ruler, you can only move in the left-hand direction, or you can move in the right-hand direction. Or if you had this vertically, you could only move up or down. But you can't leave the ruler itself. Now, the shapes in which we can draw on top of a ruler are, we can draw a very simple one, and it is just a point. Or we could draw, say, for example, 2 points, and between those points we would get a line segment. Or if we drew a line and that had neither a start nor a finish, then what we'd actually get is simply, as I said, a line. So what we find is that with a one-dimensional area or a one-dimensional space, what we find is that we only have three real shapes that we can draw. We can draw a point, a line segment, and a line. Now, the measurement that we use to measure the space consumed by these shapes is actually the measurement of distance. So we can say that distance is used to measure 1D space. Alright, cool. So, alright, that's interesting. Let's go down and let's think about, say, for example, 2D space. Now, up in the ruler, when we talk about 1D space, we're constrained to either moving in one direction or the completely opposite direction, so left or right or up or down. Imagine that we're not constrained to just moving up or down or left or right. Imagine that we can move both up, or down, left. So with these new degrees of freedom, what we find is that, let's draw an analog. If we're playing a video game and we're playing a two-dimensional video game, say for example Super Mario Brothers, we have this degree of movement where we can definitely go up, down, left or right. Now if we were going to define these directions of movement, then what we'd find is that if we go up or down, we're moving along the y-axis, and if we go left or right, we're moving along the x-axis. Now, having a look at this Super Mario scene here, what we see is there are a number of different shapes in the scene itself. So of course there's points, there's lines, and there's line segments. But more interestingly, what we find is with a two-dimensional space or working space, what we can do is we can draw shapes such as squares, we can draw shapes such as triangles, we can draw shapes such as circles. So the three main basic shapes. Now if we want to go a little bit fancier, we can go stuff like trapeziums, we can go shapes such as pentagons, or if we want to go really fancy, we'll go something like we'll go a hexagon. They're pretty cool. I like those shapes. Now moving on from that, if we were going to define the space that these shapes take up, the purple space within the shape itself is defined as area. So in one dimension, the space consumed within a 1D shape was a measurement of distance. In comparison, we have area. Area is the measurement used to describe two-dimensional space. Awesome. Now, moving on from there, okay, we've had a look at 1D space and we've had a look at 2D space. Let's have a look at something even better. Let's have a look at something called 3D space. So, of course, in 1D space, what we found is that we could move up and we could move down. So something like that. And then we could move 90 degrees either right or we could move left. But with 3D space, we add this new dimension in that we can move into the page as well as out of the page. So inward. So what we effectively find is that we've got 3 degrees of movement. Now, if again we compare it to video games, in the 2D space we had Super Mario Brothers. If we go down in the 3D space, what we can use is a very cool game called Super Mario Odyssey. So observe, if you're playing this particular game here, of course Mario can move in 3 dimensions, so it can go up and down, left and right, or inward and outward. Now, if we're going to define that using the Cartesian axes, what we'd find is that up and down, we're still going in the Y. Left and right, we're still going in the X. And then if we go in and out, we're moving on the Z-axis. Alright, cool. Now, think about the shapes that you can see in this 3D world as is. If we go back to basics and look at, say, in 2D we looked at firstly a cube. If we ask ourselves what shape is a cube in 3D space, then what we find is that this square turns into a cube. Alright, now what about a triangle? We have a triangle. What happens if we push this triangle through 3D space? Well, what happens is we do something called an extrusion, and the triangle itself becomes something called a triangular prism. Prism in that it's been extruded in the Z direction, or along the Z axis. And then imagine if we had a circle. What happens if we extrude our circle backwards? Well, what happens is the circle becomes a shape called a cylinder. Now, the area in which these 3D shapes occupy, or the space in which these 3D shapes occupy, is called it's called volume. So volume is the measurement used to describe 3D space. Excellent.